A 5-kilogram silver missile erupts from the turbid water without warning, detonating against an aluminum tinny at 50 kilometers per hour and splintering bone before the driver can even flinch. For decades along these interior river systems, this was the nightmare haunting every bend and billabong. Catchment authorities threw everything the public purse could muster at the crisis. High-voltage electrical dispersal fields pulsed across industrial channels to stun them mid-current. Targeted chemical biocides were injected straight into backwaters. Vast sums, stretching into the hundreds of millions, were committed to engineered concrete fortresses to stop these aquatic invaders from breaching the nation's most vital freshwater reservoirs. Yet none of our best engineering could break their grip. Then, along a critical inland reach, the onslaught suddenly faltered. The schools began to thin out and mysteriously vanish. It was not the concrete barriers that stopped them, nor the poison runs from biosecurity vessels. The invasion stalled because of two brutal, unforeseen forces that almost nobody saw coming. To understand how an ecological disaster unravels, you first have to grasp the sheer scale of the conquest. Decades ago, commercial aquaculture operators brought in an exotic filter-feeding carp to solve a relentless problem: farm ponds choking under thick blooms of toxic blue-green algae. The logic was deceptively simple. Introduce an animal that filters suspended green sludge out of the water column for a living, and biology does the heavy lifting for free. But our climate operates on violent boom and bust cycles. When the dry broke and sweeping inland floods breached the levee banks, those introduced fish escaped straight into the open arteries of the river basin. Within a decade, their breeding front was surging upstream through main channels, creeks, and irrigation networks, pushing inexorably toward major population centers. In this country, an invasive species with no natural co-evolved checks is an ecological bushfire in slow motion. A single mature female drops well over 1 million eggs across a single warm season. But raw fecundity is only half their biological weaponry. The true devastation lies in how they feed. Swimming with gaping mouths, they sieve the water through ultra-fine, comb-like gill rakers, stripping out microscopic zooplankton and algae so small that native fish cannot even capture it. That microscopic tier is the foundational currency of the entire river system. Every juvenile Murray cod, golden perch, and bony bream relies entirely on that exact plankton to survive its critical first weeks of life. The invader never needs to engage in direct combat. It simply consumes the bottom of the food web and starves the native ecosystem from the roots up. The ecological fallout was measured not in decades, but in the sudden, eerie collapse of the shallows. In our ancient, slow-moving riverways, native forage species like bony bream and juvenile perch are the foundational lifeblood that fuels apex predators, the grand old Murray cod and golden perch that have ruled these inland catchments since before recorded memory. Once the invader took over the water column, fisheries researchers watched those native baitfish plummet. Populations of bony bream dwindled to near nothing, their growth severely stunted by acute starvation. This was not a conventional territorial war, where animals clash over timber snags or breeding hollows. It was a systemic gutting of the aquatic food web from the bottom up. By vacuuming away the microscopic foundation, the pest hollowed out the entire river system without ever biting a native fish dot. Within a few blistering summer seasons, the scale of the infestation became almost grotesque. In long stretches of the mid-catchment, survey crews from regional primary industries and water authorities recorded more than 1,200 invasive carp packed into a single kilometer of river channel. In the worst hit reaches, introduced biomass accounted for more than 70% of every living creature under the surface. When biosecurity teams hauled research seine nets through the turbid bends, the mesh groaned under tons of writhing gray flesh, a suffocating mountain of introduced pests, with perhaps a solitary, gasping native cod trapped in the crush dot. Then came the physical danger. Unlike our secretive native species that hold deep to sunken timber, these schools react violently to the vibration of outboard motors. The high-frequency pitch of an approaching aluminium tinny triggers an explosive chain reaction panic. Dozens of heavy, muscular fish rocket out of the brown water simultaneously, transforming a quiet patrol down a billabong into a barrage of airborne blunt force. With fish slamming into boat consoles and windscreens at highway speeds, broken jaws, cracked ribs, and concussed recreational anglers began filling regional emergency room logs. Yet it was not the hazard to boaters that triggered an emergency across state and federal agencies. The true crisis lay downstream, where century-old diversion canals and pipeline networks link the inland river basin directly into the coastal freshwater network, a vast grid that supplies clean drinking water to millions of households and underpins regional fisheries worth billions. If the carp managed to breach and establish a self-sustaining foothold in those primary water reservoirs, the continent's most critical freshwater infrastructure would be permanently degraded. The biosecurity panic unleashed unprecedented public spending. Authorities engineered elaborate defensive choke points across key arterial channels. Submerged electrode arrays pulsed continuous electrical dispersal fields to turn back upstream migrants. Multi-million-dollar engineering works followed, deploying high-output underwater acoustic cannons, dense air bubble screens, and heavy mechanical locks, all designed to fortify a single geographic gateway. But heavy engineering has an inescapable flaw. It relies on predictable barriers in an unpredictable landscape. The carp were multiplying faster than concrete could cure, and an electrified line can do nothing about the rogue survivors that slip through the current. When costly infrastructure stalled, fisheries managers turned to a seductive alternative: biological retribution. If concrete and electricity could not stem the invasion, what if our waters held a native predator capable of doing the butchery for free? The candidate was a legendary, archaic apex predator, a giant that had vanished from our southern basin decades earlier. Picture a heavy freshwater brute reaching over 2 meters in length and topping 100 kilograms, encased in thick, interlocking diamond scales and armed with a broad, double-fanged jaw built to crush bone. This was a creature out of deep time, a lineage swimming through prehistoric billabongs, while giant megafauna still walked the red dirt plains. For thousands of generations, it had ruled the top of our riverine food webs. Then, human expansion erased it from the southern reaches. Early pastoralists and commercial rivermen saw a ferocious, tooth-studded giant and branded it vermin, a menace to recreational stocks that was hooked, dynamited, and dragged onto dry banks to rot in the sun. Worse still was what happened to the landscape itself. Decades of aggressive river regulation, weir construction, and agricultural levee systems severed the river channel from its vital floodplain nursery grounds. Cut off from the ephemeral lagoons where they had spawned for eons, the giant's recruitment collapsed. The last confirmed wild specimen in the southern reaches was hauled out in the mid-1960s, and within decades, authorities quietly declared the northern monster locally extinct across the entire southern catchment. The political blueprint seemed almost poetic: resurrect the ancient beast to hunt down the modern invader. By the late 1990s, government fisheries hatcheries began breeding the giant in captivity, and by 2010, fingerlings were being released into the very river channels seized by foreign carp. Regional politicians stood before Parliament and the media, hailing the prehistoric predator as the silver bullet, the one native creature with jaws wide enough to swallow adult-introduced pests whole. Media outlets eagerly sold the dramatic story of an ancient river monster coming home to reclaim its ancestral waters and tear through the invader. Yet behind the glossy public announcements, field biologists who actually reared the fish had been warning anyone who would listen. This was an ecological fairy tale. The hard mathematics fell apart instantly. Biosecurity programs managed to release only a few thousand fingerlings, of which the vast majority perished before maturity, leaving barely 1,500 scattered adults across thousands of kilometers of winding river. Set that against an invasive biomass no longer counted in individual fish, but in tens of thousands of metric tons choking the main channels. Even a fully grown native apex predator cannot perform the miracle promised in the headlines. It readily devours young, fingerling-sized carp, but the pest grows with terrifying speed, rapidly exceeding the predator's maximum gape. Within months, the invaders were untouchable. leaving our reintroduced apex giants to graze harmlessly on the fringes, while millions of carp bred unimpeded. The silver bullet fantasy had collapsed under the weight of cold biological reality. Yet the mystery in the river remained stubborn and undeniable. Out on the water, longtime commercial fishers and departmental survey teams working the critical middle reaches began reporting something unprecedented. The schools really were thinning out. Net catch rates were dropping week after week, and the swarms of leaping fish were noticeably backing off. The decline was genuine, verifiable, and measurable. But it had absolutely nothing to do with the ancient predator that had dominated the news cycles. The real salvation of the catchment was unfolding through two brutal, unglamorous mechanisms that nobody had printed on a glossy promotional poster. The first was a deliberate, industrial-scale war of attrition, fought by working crews in dirty, high-vis gear. Recognizing that passive barriers and biological legends were failing, state fisheries departments pivoted to pure economic incentivization. They put a direct per-kilogram bounty on carp, stacked right on top of commercial market rates. Instantly, every pest dragged over the gunnel was guaranteed cold cash. For rural contract crews and local commercial fishermen, who knew every deep bend and submerged snag of the river system, clearing carp ceased to be an environmental chore and became a lucrative primary industry. They did not waste time with basic rods or casual gill nets. The contractors deployed aggressive, coordinated harvesting techniques adapted from large-scale inland commercial fisheries. Stretching massive, heavy-gauge haul nets across hundreds of meters of open water, multi-boat operations systematically boxed in the schools. Crew members beat relentlessly on aluminium hulls and revved shallow-draft outboards, using the species' extreme sensitivity to underwater sound to herd thousands of panic-stricken fish into a steadily constricting pocket of reinforced netting. Once the pocket was sealed tight, hydraulic winches lifted a solid wall of thrashing biomass straight onto processing barges in a single, devastating movement. A single coordinated haul could drag 350 tons of destructive biomass out of the channel in an afternoon. Over 15 years of relentless daily pressure, those commercial crews extracted tens of thousands of metric tons from the main river corridor alone, with statewide removal tallies soaring past 35,000 tons. Crucially, these harvest runs did not wander aimlessly through remote backwaters. Catchment managers directed the fishing pressure precisely at the invasion's leading edge, the dense concentrations of mature breeding adults, staging just downstream of the major metropolitan water gateways. By methodically crushing the frontline breeders before the summer spawning run, the crews wiped out billions of potential fertilized eggs before they could ever drift downriver. The invasion was effectively being forced to devour its own momentum from the head down. To keep the harvest viable and ensure the boats stayed on the water, authorities rolled out an audacious culinary rebrand. Biologically, the meat of these filter feeders is remarkably mild, pristine, firm, and virtually free of accumulated heavy metals. But out in the regions, no diner or pub patron would ever willingly pay for a plate with the word carp printed on the menu. The government invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into a comprehensive market overhaul, officially rebranding the species under a sleek, palatable commercial label. Chefs and regional seafood distributors pushed it onto urban menus as premium fish burgers, crispy cutlets, and gourmet pub specials. The economic logic proved razor-sharp. If commercial kitchens could generate sustained consumer demand, contract fishers would haul even more tons out of the waterways to supply the processing plants. Within months of the rebrand, harvest tallies surged by another 4,500 metric tons. Yet this massive extraction was only one half of the equation. The second force holding back the invasion was an invisible barrier that no environmental engineer had ever planned or designed: the legacy of our own urban industrial contamination. For over a decade, scientists tracking tagged schools noticed that the upstream invasion hit an invisible brick wall roughly 80 kilometers downstream of the primary metropolitan water storage systems, abruptly grinding to a complete halt. A team of university researchers set out to uncover the physiological cause behind this sudden roadblock. Genomic sequencing on fish captured near the urban fringe revealed intense cellular stress markers etched directly into their biology, the distinct genetic signature of organisms burning critical metabolic energy just to survive in highly degraded water. In controlled laboratory trials, researchers submerged healthy juvenile fish into water samples taken directly from the toxic, degraded channel where the wild invasion had stalled. In clean river water, the juveniles swam actively and fed with typical aggression. In the urban water samples, they turned lethargic and disoriented almost instantly down. The mechanism came down to raw bioenergetics. As the fish pushed closer toward the city's industrial periphery, chemical toxicity, agricultural runoff, and treated industrial wastewater spiked dramatically. Merely processing those dissolved contaminants demanded so much metabolic energy from the fish's internal organs that it exhausted their fuel reserves. Pushing upstream through that toxic soup cost more calories than their filter-feeding bodies could extract from the water. Decades of heavy industrial output had inadvertently created a lethal chemical barrier that no biological invader could afford to cross. That invisible chemical frontier was reinforced by severe structural geography. Concrete-lined banks and high retaining walls along the urban canals stripped the river of the slow backwaters and flooded vegetation the carp desperately require to broadcast their eggs. Upstream, concrete weirs and heavy navigational locks fractured the water into isolated, heavily regulated cells, while downstream, commercial bounty crews worked around the clock, stripping out the breeding vanguard before it could even test the locks. When you stack industrial chemical pollution, hard concrete banks, automated infrastructure, and relentless commercial harvesting on top of one another, the great biological siege stalls out in the mud down. For years, that defensive line has held firm, roughly 80 kilometers short of our critical metropolitan drinking supplies. A handful of solitary, wandering scoutfish have slipped through the gauntlet over the seasons. One pulled from a canal in 2010, another netted in 2017, a third intercepted in 2022, each within 15 kilometers of the primary storage locks. But every intensive biosecurity sweep that followed turned up sterile water, lone vagrants wandering through concrete culverts, but never an established breeding colony down. Yet nobody managing our waterways dares mistake an engineered stalemate for an outright victory. The ecological piece holding this river together is strung together with wire and tape. Down in the lower reaches, the introduced pest still dominates the deep water holes and muddy channels. Every single mature female carries more than 1 million eggs, waiting for the next torrential wet season and major inland flood to overwhelm the system. The entire front line hinges on sustained public funding. For years, state and federal treasuries have argued over who shoulders the massive bill for permanent multi-tiered acoustic and bubble screen locks at the central bottleneck. Every time intergovernmental grants are delayed or bounty payments freeze, the commercial haul nets come out of the water. An invasive species producing millions of larvae does not hesitate when human pressure slackens. Meanwhile, our ancient native giants continue to be quietly released back into their ancestral billabongs. Slowly, they are reclaiming their place in the river, not as the sensationalized monster weapon splashed across sensationalist media headlines, but simply as a native animal returned to the water where it belongs. The biological crisis was never halted by a mythical savior or a single triumphant piece of engineering. The line was held by gritty commercial haulers, hauling tons of fish in the midday heat, by restaurant patrons buying renamed fillets, and by the unintended consequence of our own industrial runoff. If you value this kind of unvarnished ecological reality, where messy, unglamorous facts routinely overturn comfortable legends, make sure to subscribe. There are plenty more true stories of our waterways still waiting to be told.